In 1968, Dick Fosbury won the Olympic Games using a different high jump technique, which has now become known as the Fosbury flop. The Fosbury flop is identified by 3 phases. The first is the approach or the run-up, which serves as a preparation for the takeoff phase. The flop involves a curved J-shaped run-up. The first 5 to 6 steps of the run-up are done in a straight line perpendicular to the mats. However, the final 4 to 5 steps follow a radial curve. The second phase is the takeoff, the period from when the takeoff foot makes contact with the ground and then leaves the ground. The final stage is the jump. In the flop, athletes travel perpendicularly over the bar on their back in an arch position. The flop has enabled athletes to achieve significantly higher heights compared to preceding techniques, such as the scissor jump, western roll, and the straddle. The 2 primary differences between the flop and preceding techniques are the arched orientation of jumpers over the bar and the curved approach. DAPNA 2000. Biomechanists have recognised that the Fosbury flop utilises many biomechanical principles that enable athletes to clear the exceedingly high heights.
Hamel and colleagues define biomechanics as a study of motion and the effects of forces on an object. Biomechanics is divided into kinematics and kinetics. Kinematics analyses motion, whereas kinetics analyses the forces acting upon a body. Sports biomechanists use both qualitative and quantitative movement pattern analysis when analysing human movement. Hamel and colleagues emphasize the superiority of qualitative analysis through methods such as videography for skill intervention. Therefore, we will use qualitative biomechanical analysis when working with our high jump up-and-comer Jennifer. However, before we perform a biomechanical analysis of Jennifer, we will outline the biomechanical principles involved in the various stages of the Fosbury flop and how they are necessary to enhance performance.
The beginning of the run-up is structured by a straight approach perpendicular to the bar of approximately 5 to 6 steps. This is done at approximately the athlete's 400 to 800 metre pace. The purpose of the straight approach is to generate momentum. Bartlett defines momentum as the quantity of motion possessed by a particle or rigid body measured by the product of its mass and the velocity of its centre of mass. By progressively developing momentum, this enables the athlete to position their body in an upright position in preparation for the curve phase.
It is crucial that athletes accelerate in the curve phase of the run-up. Acceleration is defined as the rate of change of velocity with respect to time. When an athlete accelerates, they move at a higher velocity. In high jump, this is called centripetal acceleration, the rate of change of tangential velocity. The faster the rate of centripetal acceleration, the stronger the centripetal force that can be generated.
One of the main purposes of the curve is to position the athlete so that they are leaning away from the bar at the start of the takeoff phase, DAPNA 2000. The curved approach also promotes an inward lean of the body towards the axis of rotation. DAPNA 2000 states that this allows the athletes to run the curve at a greater velocity as their centre of gravity travels a shorter distance than their footprints. This increased velocity and inward lean generates greater centripetal force, a force that pulls an object towards the axis of rotation in order to make it follow a curved or circular pathway. Card 2007, page 74. The greater the centripetal acceleration, the greater the centripetal force, which ultimately allows a greater amount of force to be transferred into the jump.
2 pathways are generated when an athlete runs the curve. Their footprints trace one, and the other traces their line of centre of gravity, as demonstrated in the diagram. Centre of gravity is the average location of the weight of an object. An athlete's centre of gravity can shift with movement. This diagram highlights how an athlete's centre of gravity follows a shorter path, closer to the axis of rotation. This not only enables the athlete to run the curve in the quickest time possible, enhancing centripetal velocity and force, but it also enables the athlete to lower their centre of mass.
DePina and Ficklin write that in order to maximize the vertical force in the takeoff phase of the run-up, it is necessary for an athlete's centre of mass to be in a low position at the start of the takeoff. The centre of mass is the main position of the mass is in an object. The lean generated by the curve enables the athlete to lower their centre of mass without lowering their centre of gravity, changing their running technique, or losing speed.
Takeoff step is often referred to as the penultimate step as it determines the transfer of momentum and force into the jump. High jumpers should plant their takeoff leg in front of their body as evidenced in the diagram. This generates a back inclination where the athlete leans backwards and lowers their centre of gravity. Late no date. When the takeoff leg is planted ahead of the body, the knee extensor muscles resist the flexion of the leg, forcing the leg to flex due to the continued forward momentum of the jumper, DAPNA 2000. As momentum causes the jumper to go from a backwards lean to an upright position, the extensor muscles of the knee of the takeoff leg stretch. The muscles of the takeoff leg then undergo eccentric muscular contraction, whereby increased tension of the muscles causes them to lengthen as the takeoff leg begins to leave the ground. Additionally, by planning the takeoff leg ahead of the body, this increases the amount of time in which ground reaction force is exerted, consequently increasing the vertical force that is transferred to the jumper. Daphne 2000.
Ground reaction force is the process that converts centripetal force generated by the curve into vertical lift. Ground reaction force is an example of Newton's third law of motion, which simply states for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. During the takeoff phase, the ground reaction force generated by the takeoff step is equal to the upward force exerted from the ground, which is transferred to the athlete to propel them into the air. This upward force is known as vertical force, a push or pull in the upward direction to cause a motion like jumping. The three factors that determine the amount of ground reaction force generated are the velocity of the curve, positioning of the foot ahead of the body, and the arm and leg drive.
Summation of forces identifies that to generate the most force you need to utilise as many muscles and body parts as possible, as muscular contractions produce force, KISS 2010. There are two ways force can be summated, sequentially or simultaneously. High jumpers utilise simultaneous summation of force as they have a very short amount of time to generate the most force to exert onto the ground, Bartlett 2007. Simultaneous summation of force refers to multiple body segments and muscles being utilised simultaneously to produce maximum force in the smallest amount of time, Bartlett 2007. Simultaneous summation of force is evidenced in high jump by the simultaneous arm and leg drive in the takeoff phase. This increases the amount of downward force generated by the athlete onto the ground, which in turn increases the amount of force the ground exerts upon the athlete to propel them into the air.
As the arms and lead leg are accelerated upwards during the takeoff phase, they exert a greater force downwards on the ground by the takeoff leg, which in turn evokes an increased vertical force exerted by the ground on the jumper. Similarly to the muscles and joints in the takeoff leg, the muscles and joints in the arms and lead leg undergo flexion. It is crucial that the arm drive is done simultaneously with the knee drive. This simultaneous action not only enhances simultaneous summation of force and ground reaction force, it also enables the momentum generated in the approach to be transferred into angular momentum.
Angular momentum is the quantity of motion that a rotating body or object possesses. Angular momentum in high jump is generated by the upward drive of both arms and the lead leg. Angular momentum not only supplements ground reaction force, it enables jumpers to rotate onto their back so that they can travel perpendicular over the bar. It is crucial that angular momentum is generated whilst the takeoff foot is still in contact with the ground. The principle of conservation in angular momentum acknowledges that angular momentum generated at takeoff is conserved during flight. Therefore, the arms and lead leg must be driven upwards in a way that enables the jumper to rotate into the optimal position perpendicular to the bar.
High jumpers must rotate inwardly around the vertical longitudinal axis in order to twist their bodies into a position that allows them to travel perpendicularly over the bar. This twisting action is caused by the lateral inclination generated by the lean and an active rotation of the shoulders. If jumpers do not emphasize an active rotation of the shoulders, they will not be able to rotate onto their backs as they travel over the bar. Therefore, it is important that the arm and lead leg drive is done upwardly and diagonally across the body, as shown in the diagram, so that the jumper's body can rotate and travel over the bar in an arched position on their back.
The flight of a high jumper is characterized by a sharp inverted parabola. A sharp parabola demonstrates that the athlete is jumping up rather than over the bar. The Fosbury flop has enabled athletes to clear heights significantly higher than what they previously could using preceding techniques. Ultimately, high jumpers generate centripetal force to increase their vertical jump and angular momentum so that they can arch perpendicularly over the bar. This allows an athlete's hips to clear the greatest height, however their centre of mass passes below the bar, as demonstrated in the diagram.
The flight phase of Fosbury flop exemplifies the postulates of Newton's second law of motion. When a force acts upon a body, the change in momentum experienced by the body takes place in the direction of the force and is directly proportional to the magnitude of the force and the length of time that the force acts. The approach and takeoff phases are designed to develop the greatest amount of vertical force and kinetic energy so that athletes can jump as high as they can before gravity acts against them. However, the peak of the jump is the point at which gravitational potential energy becomes greater than the kinetic energy of the jumper, and gravity pulls the jumper towards Earth. Therefore, it is crucial to develop the greatest amount of vertical force, as this increases the amount of kinetic energy, which allows high jumpers to jump higher before feeling the effects of gravity.
Jennifer has just qualified to compete at district athletics after winning the high jump event at her school's athletics carnival. Miss Perry is in charge of training the high jumpers so that their school can retain the district champion shield for the 4th year in a row. Miss Perry has hired the help of Emily, a biomechanist, to analyse Jennifer's Fosbury flop technique and identify areas that she can improve upon. The purpose of this session is to qualitatively analyse Jennifer's technique and determine the positives and limitations of Jennifer's Fosbury flop. In reviewing the footage of Jennifer's jumps, we determined that she is at the first stage of Newell's 1985 model of motor learning, assembling a coordinated pattern. She has established the foundational movements of the Fosbury flop, however she has not learnt how to effectively coordinate her movements. In reviewing Jennifer's jumps in slow motion, there is one predominant issue that stands out. She travels over the bar on her side rather than perpendicularly on her back. The effect of this issue is that she is unable to arch her back over the bar. A key indicator of this issue is Jennifer's landing position. She lands facing diagonally rather than perpendicularly. In comparing Jennifer's flight over the bar and her landing position to those of an elite athlete, qualitative footage suggests that she has not rotated her body. This inhibits her ability to arch over the bar to clear higher heights. Therefore, we need to look further back into Jennifer's run-up to determine the underlying cause of this problem, as DAPNA 2000 states that the run-up and take-off implements the flight of an athlete.
The athletes use a J-shaped run-up, whereas Jennifer approaches the bar at a more linear angle. DAPNA recognises that a curved run-up has two primary functions. It generates centripetal force, which is transferred into vertical lift, and it enables athletes to rotate over the bar. Firstly, the curved approach promotes an inward lean of the body towards the axis of rotation. DAPNA states that this allows the athlete to run the curve at a greater velocity as their centre of gravity travels a shorter distance than their footprints, as shown in the diagram. This increased velocity and inward lean generates greater centripetal force. As aforementioned, the greater the centripetal force, the greater the amount of ground reaction force exerted by the athlete, which in turn results in a greater vertical force exerted onto the athlete by the ground.
Reviewing Jennifer's approach, she approaches at a 45-degree diagonal angle, leans towards the bar and does not accelerate. Thus, she has not developed centripetal force, as this is done by accelerating into the curve, running a radial path, and leaning inward towards the axis of rotation. This decreases the amount of ground reaction force Jennifer exerts upon the ground. Consequently, only a small amount of vertical force is generated. Additionally, by approaching the bar this way, her body position at takeoff prevents her from rotating onto her back. DAPNA 2000 recognises that the second function of the curved approach is to position the body so that angular momentum can rotate the body inwardly around the longitudinal axis of rotation. In the takeoff phase, the simultaneous upward drive of the arms and lead leg not only summates force downward onto the ground, increasing the ground reaction force of the athlete, it also enables momentum generated in the approach to be transferred into angular momentum, DAPNA 2000. An elite athlete will generate angular momentum by driving their arms and lead leg upwards and across their body to facilitate the shoulder rotation prior to leaving the ground, which enables them to clear the bar perpendicularly on their back.
In reviewing Jennifer's takeoff, she leans into the bar and does not rotate her shoulders. Furthermore, she does not drive her arms or lead leg upward and across her body to facilitate this rotation. Therefore, as she takes off, she holds her body in a rigid up and down manner, inhibiting her from rotating her onto her back before leaving the ground. The limited momentum generated from her approach is not converted into angular momentum, thus she travels over the bar on her side rather than perpendicularly on her back. We have chosen to use constraints-led approach in the coming 3 training sessions. The CLA emphasises self-organisation under constraint manipulation. Constraint manipulation involves the implementation of constraints, which creates instability within learners, forcing them to use subconscious explorative mechanisms to self-organise, facilitating the emergence of functional movement solutions in response to these constraints. We identified that the primary problem in Jen's high jump is that she does not rotate onto her back, so she is unable to clear the bar perpendicularly. Ultimately, the approach influences the takeoff, which influences the flight of a jumper. Therefore, we have designed a task that will hopefully enable Jennifer to self-organise her movements, facilitating the emergence of the lean in the curved part of her approach.
For the first training session, Miss Perry designed an activity called Cat and Mouse. In front of the high jump mat, she set up cones to mark a circular path. She gave Jennifer the instruction, run as fast as you can around the outside of the cone so that I don't catch you. This is an example of both task and environmental constraint manipulation, the environmental constraint being the cones and the task constraint being the instruction. This instruction is an example of one of the key principles of the CLA, intrinsic feedback with an external focus of attention. As Jennifer was focusing on running as fast as she could, this allowed her movements to self-organise subconsciously in response to the task constraint and the cones. Initially, Jennifer struggled to maintain stability as she ran around the cones, as she was unable to control her speed whilst running around the tight circle. Therefore, Jennifer was faced with a period of instability. Davids and colleagues 2008 recognised that when faced with instability, dynamic systems subliminally seek stability. When systems exhibit stability and functional patterns of organisation, they are said to have reached an attractor state. Davids and colleagues acknowledge that instability enables complex dynamic systems to self-organise and form attractor states through a process called metastability. When Jennifer initially felt this instability, she straightened up, slowed down, and ran a less radial path. This is due to the fact that she recognised and assumed the pre-established attractor state that she uses when sprinting. She positioned her body in a rigid vertical manner. However, this inhibited her from being able to run as fast as she was unable to run close to the cones, thus she was running a further distance. This period of instability enabled her to self-organise her movements and develop a new attractor state. Jennifer began to run, however, she leaned into the centre of the circle. In doing this, she ran faster as her body travelled on a shorter, more radial path, thus she developed centripetal force. In order to reach this attractor state, Jennifer had to become attuned to the affordances of the invariant, constant information perceived in her environment. Xiao and colleagues 2016 identified that constraints provide athletes with affordances, information that can inform movement sequences. Davids and colleagues 2008 suggest that constraints encourage learners to use perception-action couplings to perceive invariant information offered, become attuned to these affordances, and self-organise movements accordingly. In this activity, Jennifer had to become attuned to the interoceptive information of her body and how it responded to the exteroceptive information of the cones. Jennifer determined that she could still run with her body in a fixed, rigid, upright position. However, if she leant towards the centre of the circle, her centre of gravity could travel within the cones while her feet travelled around the cones. Therefore, Jennifer used the process of degeneracy to achieve a higher level of metastability by freeing and freezing multiple degrees of freedom. Davids and colleagues 2006 refer to degeneracy as enabling degrees of freedom to assume various patterns of organisation. Particularly, as Jennifer recognised that the lean could generate greater speed, she freed many body segments such as her hips to initiate this lean.
Ultimately, Jennifer was able to self-organise her movements through the process of degeneracy and metastability to find the most efficient way to satisfy the task goal of running around the cones as fast as possible. The emergent behaviour was that she leaned into the curve. By leaning into the curve, Jennifer was able to generate a greater amount of centripetal force. After a few attempts, we determined that this constraint had decayed as degeneracy and metastability had occurred, as Jennifer was comfortably running around the curve with a lean at a relatively high speed. Therefore, we asked Jennifer to perform a few full run-ups jumps to see if this had resolved her rotation problem. In reviewing Jennifer's jumps at the end of the session, we identified that she had begun to use a lean and approach the bar on more of a curved path. However, although this was an improvement from last week's session, she was still travelling over the bar on her side, as there was no rotation of her shoulders. Therefore, we need to develop a constraint for next week's session that will emphasise the shoulder rotation in the takeoff phase. For the second training session, Emily and Miss Perry designed an activity called one-steppers. Jennifer was provided with the instruction, using one step, jump over the bar and land perpendicular to the bar, facing the trees. This task constraint, again, uses instruction with an external focus of attention, as Jennifer focused on her landing position rather than rotating her body.
Initially, we observed that Jennifer jumped over the bar and landed on a diagonal angle rather than perpendicular to the bar. Once again, this constraint generated instability, causing Jennifer to recognise and assume a pre-established attractor state. She reverted back to her scissors jump body position by freezing her hips and upper body. After a few attempts, we observed her begin to recognise the attractor state developed in the previous constraint. She leaned away from the bar as she took off. However, once again, she was faced with instability as she was still landing on a diagonal angle. Jennifer was faced with the problem of identifying a subjective affordance in her degrees of freedom that would enable her to rotate her body onto her back.
Jennifer then began to rotate her upper body and shoulders inwards so that as she jumped, her back was already towards the bar. Therefore, Jennifer utilised degeneracy by freeing more degrees of freedom in order to achieve metastability and develop an attractor state. Degeneracy and metastability facilitated the emergence of the intended movement sequence. Jennifer rotated her upper body during the takeoff phase. Consequently, Jennifer successfully completed the task goal, as this upper body rotation allowed her to travel over the bar on her back and land perpendicularly on the mat facing the trees. After several successful jumps, we determined that the constraint had decayed, thus we asked Jennifer to perform a few complete jumps to see if this had resolved her rotation problem. We observed that she used her lean and rotated her shoulders as she took off, which allowed her to travel over the bar on her back. However, we observed that Jennifer did not jump as high and she landed further back on the mats. Therefore, angular momentum was not generated. Rather, she carried the centripetal force and horizontal momentum generated from the run-up across the bar. Therefore, a third constraint needs to be designed to allow centripetal force to be transferred into angular momentum to enhance the vertical jump.
For the third training session, Emily and Miss Perry designed an activity called X marks the spot. For this activity, different point zones were marked on the mat, as identified in the diagram. To score the most points, Jennifer had to land before the halfway line on the mat, facing towards the trees. Jennifer was given the instruction, you have 5 jumps to score the most amount of points as possible. This task constraint again uses instruction with an external focus of attention, as Jennifer was focused on her landing position rather than internally focusing on her technique. The objective of this activity was for Jennifer to synchronize her shoulder rotation with a simultaneous arm and lead leg drive to generate angular momentum.
Initially, Jennifer jumped and landed within the point zone. However, she landed facing sideways, scoring only 1 point. It can be seen how this simple rule manipulation created instability in Jennifer. She recognized that she needed to jump upwards, so she reverted back to her scissors body position, and she approached the bar at a linear angle. Consequently, we observed Jennifer utilizing metastability as she recognized the 2 attractive states she developed in the preceding constraints and organized her movements so that she leaned into the curve and rotated her upper body and shoulders at takeoff. However, as observed in last week's training session, although she landed perpendicular, she landed further back on the mat. Therefore, Jennifer needed to use degeneracy to utilize more degrees of freedom in order to transfer centripetal force into angular momentum. We then observed Jennifer utilizing more degrees of freedom in her takeoff. She began to drive her right arm and leg upwards and across her body. Consequently, she landed perpendicular in the point zone, satisfying the task goal. By simultaneously driving her right arm and leg across her body, this enabled Jennifer to simultaneously summate vertical force and angular momentum, which enabled her to jump upwards and rotate onto her back. Therefore, we determined that the constraint had decayed as the intended movement sequence had emerged. She drove her arm and lead leg upwards and across her body. This enabled her to generate angular momentum, something that was previously missing from and inhibiting her jump. Goal setting is the process of deciding what you want to accomplish and devising a plan to achieve the result you desire. Goal setting is powerful because it provides focus. Jen's goal was to improve her high jump, run-up, and jump. She would like to be successful when competing at the district finals. Along with the help of her coach and biomechanist, Jen has set herself some progressive short-term goals for each session, as well as an overall goal of jumping a height of 123 centimeters at districts. Jen's goal for the first session was to improve her lean and curve part of her approach. Her goal for the second session was to implement shoulder rotation and land perpendicular to the bar, and the goal Jen was aiming to achieve in the third session was to generate an arm and knee drive, creating angular momentum, getting her up and over the bar, and rotating her body.
The Fosbury flop is an incredibly complex event, therefore it is important to establish the fundamental biomechanical principles necessary to perform the flop before improving more complex and specialized actions such as the arch. By the fourth session, we concluded that Jennifer had progressed to the second stage of Newell's 1985 model of motor learning, as she had developed greater control over her movements through the processes of degeneracy and metastability. In reflecting on the constraints that we designed, we believe that they effectively enabled Jennifer to develop foundational attractor states and greater control over the body parts necessary to utilize the fundamental biomechanical principles necessary to perform the Fosbury flop. Constraint manipulation enabled Jennifer to subliminally self-organize her movements so that she could effectively position herself perpendicularly over the bar. Now that she is in a biomechanically efficient position, in the coming sessions we intend to work on her arch.